Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose is the gentleman from California
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 306 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 306, resolution urging the Republic of Turkey to safeguard its Christian heritage and to return confiscated church properties.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include at that time extraneous material on this bill.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, each will. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I rise to oppose the resolution and claim time in opposition to the resolution.
Does the gentleman from California favor the motion? Does the other gentleman from California favor the motion?
I do.
On that basis, the gentleman from Kentucky will control 20 minutes in opposition.
May I ask, Mr. Speaker, then unanimous consent to yield half of my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman, and that he may be able to control that time.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized.
Then I'll yield myself such time as I might consume, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by quoting Thomas Jefferson. He said, "In our early struggles for liberty, religious freedom could not fail to become a primary object." Jefferson was a very smart man, and he understood that the core foundation of democracy relied on individual differences and opinions without fear of intimidation. And this concept is one that we as Americans have benefited from since our founding. Religious freedom has played an integral part of our continued success as a country. Sadly, very sadly, this is a freedom that so many countries like Turkey still struggle to realize. And today we're considering this House Resolution 306, which I authored with Ranking Member Howard Berman, urging the Republic of Turkey to safeguard its Christian heritage and return confiscated church properties to their rightful owners. Unfortunately, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has had to put Turkey on its watch list for 3 straight years now. And the Commission reports that the Turkish government's formal, long-standing efforts to control religion by imposing suffocating regulations and by denying full legal status to religious institutions results in serious religious freedoms violations. The government has failed to take decisive action to correct the climate of impunity against religious minorities and to make the necessary institutional reforms to reverse these conditions. Now, those are the words of the Commission itself on this subject. Religious tolerance has long been a problem for Turkey. Turkey has yet to remedy the desecration of religious properties of over 2 million Armenians and Greeks and Assyrians and Syriacs over the last 100 years. Until these obligations are fulfilled, religious freedom will remain elusive, and frankly, relations with the United States will suffer. Prime Minister Erdogan recently issued a decree to return confiscated church property taken after 1936, but the majority of confiscated religious properties, of course, were taken prior to 1936. We are sending a signal today that Turkey should reassess the cutoff date, and I would suggest that outside pressure and actions like we're taking here today, and reports like the Religious Commission, have helped with what progress we have seen to date. The United States has a vested interest to advance religious freedom. Turkey's claims to be a secular country is not enough when dealing with the day-to-day discriminatory harassment that religious minorities face there. For actions speak louder than words. There are very few religious minorities in Turkey. These are men and women struggling to practice their faith they need added protection. So this resolution urges Turkey to end all forms of religious discrimination, to allow rightful church properties to organize and train and teach and practice religious activities without hindrance or restriction, and to return church properties and relics to its rightful owners, whether that be places of worship or monasteries or schools or hospitals or holy sites or other artifacts. And lastly, to allow religious minority groups to own religious properties so that they can preserve and reconstruct and repair religious properties as they see fit. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right, so I urge the passage of this House Resolution 306 urging the Republic of Turkey to safeguard its Christian heritage and return confiscated church properties. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I've read Resolution 306, and certainly there's nothing in the language of this resolution that very many people would oppose. It basically says that it is the sense of the House of Representatives that the Secretary of State in all official contacts with Turkish leaders and other Turkish officials should emphasize that Turkey should end all forms of religious discriminations, and then it goes on from there. Now, this resolution, in a way, reminds me of asking someone, do they still beat their children? Because whatever they answer, they're going to be condemned. And the mere fact that the resolution is being introduced would leave an objective observer with the opinion that religious freedom is being systematically denied in Turkey. So let's just look at a few of the facts. On September 13th, 2011, during a briefing on the release of U.S. Department of State International Religious Freedom Report, Secretary Clinton praised Turkey's recent steps in enhancing religious freedom. We've also seen Turkey take serious steps to improve the climate for religious tolerance. The Turkish government issued a decree in August that invited non-Muslims to reclaim churches and synagogues that were confiscated 75 years ago. And this was the language of Secretary Clinton. I applaud Prime Minister Erdogan's very important commitment to doing so. And in its 13th annual report on international religious freedom, the U.S. Department of State also underscored Turkey's recent efforts. During the reporting period, the government took steps to improve religious freedom. Notably, the government permitted religious services to be held annually in historic Christian sites that had been turned into state museums after decades of disuse. These positive statements have shown that Turkey has good intentions in pursuing religious freedom. And I might say that last year the Turkish Prime Minister issued a circular that emphasized the right of all Turkish people, Muslim and non-Muslim, to enjoy their religious cultures and identities. Prime Minister Erdogan has urged all government institutions to act in accordance with this message. So I think it's quite clear that while this resolution has no binding legal effect, has no authority over Turkey whatsoever, we can see that Turkey is taking specific steps to ensure religious freedom in Turkey, and they're doing so without any prodding from the U.S. So at this time, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California, Mr. Berman.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of Res 306 and yield initially 3 minutes to a leader in this effort for a very long time, my colleague and neighbor from California, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from California for yielding and for his leadership on this important issue. From the spring of 1915 and continuing for the next 8 years, the forces of the Ottoman Empire, police and military, engaged in a genocide of the Armenian people living within the borders of their dying empire. When it was over, more than 1.5 million men, women, and children were killed in the first genocide of the 20th century. They were beaten, shot, marched to their deaths through scorching deserts or across frigid mountains, and left where they fell. Families and entire communities were destroyed as the Ottomans did everything in their power to make a people disappear. But the physical near annihilation of the Armenian people was not enough to satisfy the Turks' desire to wreak vengeance on Armenia, which was the first nation in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion in AD 301. Their campaign against the Armenians was broader and was aimed at destroying not only the Armenian people, but also their history, their culture, and their faith. When Ottoman forces began to massacre their Armenian neighbors 95 years ago, there were nearly 2,000 Armenian churches in what is now Turkey. Fewer than 100 remain standing and fully functioning today. One of the world's oldest Christian communities has, in significant part, disappeared from its ancestral homeland. While the Armenian genocide stands as a singular event, the persecution of the Armenians has continued, and much of it centers on the Armenian status as a Christian minority in an overwhelmingly Muslim country, where discriminatory laws are used to confiscate church property and prevent free worship. And other Christian communities, especially the Greek Orthodox, have also been the victims of Turkish intolerance. In northern Cyprus, which was invaded by the Turkish army in 1974, churches have been left to rot, cemeteries have been desecrated or fallen into disrepair, and priests are forbidden from accessing the churches they prayed in as children. Earlier this year, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom noted in its 2011 report, quote, "The Turkish government continues to impose serious limitations on freedom of religion or belief, thereby threatening the continued vitality and survival of minority religious communities in Turkey." Ours is a nation that has prized freedom of religion. For more than 2 centuries, we have stood for tolerance of other faiths, and American diplomats, members of Congress, and presidents have consistently pressed other governments to respect and protect their minorities. This resolution is in the finest tradition of advocacy for those whose voices have been silenced, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor and to join my colleagues, especially Mr. Royce and Mr. Berman, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, a friend who has been a leader on these issues throughout his years of service in the House. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California. Still his time. Still his time under control. Okay.
I'll yield some time to the gentleman later on, but you have some time now, so
Yes.
if you would go on your time, I will yield to you later.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Berman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself 2.5 minutes.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Christian communities of Turkey, once populous and prosperous, have now for many decades been victims of discrimination. The result has been a drastic decline in the Christian population. Whereas well over 2 million Christians lived in Anatolia a century ago, today there are only a few thousand, less than 1% of Turkey's population. Although Christians clearly constitute no threat to the majority, the various Christian communities remain the victims of unceasing discrimination. Their churches have been desecrated, their properties confiscated, and they are denied the right to practice their religion as they see fit or train their clergy. Through this resolution, we're asking Turkey rectify this terrible situation. Much of the worst damage to and the confiscation of Christian properties was done in the early decades of the Turkish Republic, but it continues to some extent today. Some 3 months after the introduction of this resolution in June, Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan responded with a decree that would return a small percentage of the property confiscated from religious minorities, as well as provide compensation for property that was seized and later sold. This is too little and too late. It doesn't even begin to make up for the years of loss and the damaging impact on the minority communities, but it does appear to be a step in the right direction. We will watch its implementation closely. Meanwhile, the Turkish government must also address the many other forms of discrimination that Christians in Turkey endure. Every church in Turkey suffers petty harassment at a minimum and is forced to apply to central authorities for authorization to do any type of repairs or construction, requests that often linger for months and years without government action. Moreover, Turkey recognizes certain Christian groups as legitimate, but not others. If you belong to one of the unauthorized groups, such as evangelicals, you can't even build a church. This resolution calls on Turkey to make good on all past transgressions and allow true freedom of religion, to achieve the standards of democratic behavior to which it says, and to which I believe it aspires. We want Turkey to allow its Christian citizens to worship exactly as they want, and to allow them to train their clergy exactly as they want. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman reserves balance of time. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I yield myself 4 minutes.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 4 minutes.
I might say that Turkey certainly has been a valuable ally of the United States for many years. As we all know, it is the only Muslim nation in NATO. It has been a vital partner to the United States in the war on terror in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. And just recently, Turkey agreed to host a NATO radar defense system directed toward Iran. Turkey also is becoming an increasing important commercial partner. But I wanted to also point out about 3 years ago, without any input from the U.S. Congress, the Secretary of State, or anyone else in the federal government, the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey, on his own initiation, had one of his religious scholars of the Muslim faith spend a semester at Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington, D.C. And during that semester, there was a dialogue between members of the Christian faith and members of the Muslim faith. And during that time, there was not any finger pointing. There was not any accusing the other side of being mean-spirited or anything else, but it was simply an exchange of ideas. That was at the initiative of the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey. I might also point out that in October, the Archbishop of the Armenian Orthodox Church reconsecrated St. Georgos, an Armenian church near Lake Van in Turkey. That church has recently been renovated. I would also say that on November the 11th of 2010, Turkish authorities returned a former orphanage on Princess Island to the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate following a decision by the European Court of Human Rights. And the attorney representing the Patriarchate declared, "This marks a first in Europe. Turkey became the first country to implement a decision. This should be an example of other countries." So I think it's very clear that Turkey is moving in the right direction. They do not need to be condemned, in my view. They are a vital ally of the U.S. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time. I mean, not yield the balance of my time, but I would reserve the balance of my time.
Okay, the gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California, Mr. Royce. Who yields time?
I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to add an additional half minute from
Gentleman from California is represented for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. The adoption of H.Res. 306 would add a powerful voice of the United States Congress to the defense of religious freedom for Christians in present-day Turkey and reinforce the traditional leadership of Congress in defending freedom of faith around the world. I want to identify myself with the comments of the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, on putting this resolution in context by noting the Armenian genocide and how that sets the stage for everything we're talking about here. HRES 306 is urgently needed to address the destruction of Christian religious heritage as a result of the Turkish government's theft, desecration, and disregard of ancient Christian sites and churches, many of them holding great significance to Christian heritage. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom raises the following alarm in its 2001 report. The Turkish government continues to impose serious limitations on freedom of religion or belief, thereby threatening the continued vitality and survival of minority religious communities in Turkey. Churches in Turkey have been desecrated. The adoption of HRES 306 would support the Christian communities within Turkey who remain vulnerable and are forced to endure restrictions on the right to practice their faith in freedom. For example, and this is just one example, of the over 2,000 Armenian churches which existed in the early 1900s, less than 100 remain standing and fully functioning today. This resolution is supported by the co-chairs of the Armenian, Hellenic, and Human Rights Caucuses. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has, for 3 years straight, placed Turkey on its watch list. In 2009, Bartholomew I, the ecumenical Christian Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes and reported that Turkey's Christians were second-class citizens and that he personally felt crucified by a state that wanted his church to die out. Church property is routinely confiscated through discriminatory laws. The United States Commission on Religious Freedom reported that over the previous 5 decades, the Turkish state has, using convoluted regulations and undemocratic laws, confiscated hundreds of religious minority properties, primarily those belonging to the Greek Orthodox community, as well as the Armenian Orthodox, Catholics, and Jews. It is time to add the voice of the American Congress in an effort to make sure that Turkey meets its international responsibilities.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Royce. Reserve.
I'll reserve the balance of my time to close.
Gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I may just make one other comment about Turkey. We all know that with the Arab Spring and the movement toward more free governments in the Middle East, that Prime Minister Erdogan has been one of the real leaders. He has spoken up against Syria. He has spoken up against Egypt. He has spoken against Tunisia and other countries, and has been a real leader in trying to bring about a measure of freedom in that area. I might also say that the time period that's been discussed earlier about the early 1900s, of course, during World War I, when a lot of these things took place, the country, the Ottoman Empire, was fighting for its mere existence at that time, and there were a lot of atrocities that took place on both sides. But as I said, this resolution, there's certainly not anything in this resolution for anyone to oppose, but I think that we should recognize that Turkey is making great strides, that they are returning properties, that they are taking a step, as has been pointed out by Secretary of State Clinton and by the religious watch organizations and others. Now, at this time, I'd be happy to yield. Mr. Berman had requested that I yield some time. I'd be happy to yield some time to someone on that side if they would care to have it.
Well, if the gentleman would yield, I'd be very grateful if the gentleman would yield 2 minutes to my friend from New York, distinguished member.
I'd be happy to
Mr.
yield
Engel.
2 minutes to the gentleman from New York.
From New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from California and also the gentleman from Kentucky for yielding to me. I rise in support of the resolution. Mr. Speaker, I've become increasingly concerned with the direction of Turkey in the past few years. It's elected an Islamist government which has pushed the country toward Iran and into conflict with Israel. While I'm relieved that ANCA is now taking a strong stand against the repression in Syria, finally, but much needs to change in Turkey. In particular, Turkey, which has such a profound connection with the birth and growth of Christianity, has today expropriated church properties, harassed worshippers, and refused to grant full legal status to some Christian groups. In fact, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom placed Turkey on its watch list for the third straight year and concluded that, quote, the Turkish government continues to impose serious limitations on freedom of religion or belief, thereby threatening the continued vitality and survival of religious communities in Turkey, unquote. I therefore rise in strong support of HRS 306, which urges Turkey to return stolen Christian churches to the Armenian, Greek, Assyrian, and Syriac communities, and to end discrimination against surviving Christians. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky. Gentleman from Kentucky Reserve.
I'll maintain the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Kentucky Reserve. Gentleman from California, Mr. Berman.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2.5 minutes to Chairman, co-chair of the Armenian caucus, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Berman. I'm proud to rise in support of House Resolution 306, urging the Republic of Turkey to safeguard its Christian heritage and to return confiscated church properties. As an original co-sponsor of this resolution, I believe that its adoption is critically important to showing that the U.S. Congress will not remain silent while countries such as Turkey violate basic religious freedoms. This resolution is needed because the sad reality is that minority religious communities in Turkey daily face oppressive policies propagated by the Turkish government. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has found, and I quote, the Turkish government's formal, long-standing efforts to control religion by imposing suffocating regulations and by denying full legal status to religious institutions results in serious religious freedom violations. And the Commission has recommended that the U.S. urge Turkey to comply with its international commitments regarding freedom of religion or belief, and that is exactly what this resolution does. Now, many within Turkey today and many more have fled religious persecution over the past century, knowing the frightening consequences that religious persecution has had on Christians and their churches. Each year, the Armenian Issues Caucus, which I co-chair, gathers to commemorate the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenians were killed in the genocide over 90 years ago. But Armenians in Turkey and their churches and landmarks and cemeteries continue to be targets for Turkish persecution. You know, I wanted to mention to my colleague, and I respect my colleague from Kentucky a great deal, the fact of the matter is that Turkey has never admitted that the genocide has occurred. And the fact that, you mentioned that in World War I, well, there were problems on both sides, but the fact of the matter is that over 1 million Armenians were massacred, and their churches and everything continue to be targets today. The resolution further calls on Turkey to stop its oppressive policies towards the education of Greek priests and its overt attempts to pressure the ecumenical patriarchate to leave his home country. Can you imagine that they're asking the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church to leave Turkey, where he and the patriarchate have been for, 2,000 years? So I really believe if you believe that we should have freedom to practice your religion without interference of oppressive governments, then you should really vote yes on this resolution. And the fact of the matter is that Turkey continues to do all these things. The suggestion I know my colleague has made from Kentucky that somehow they're doing a better job, it's just very token, and there are just as many instances where they continue the oppression that compared to those few where maybe they've tried. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. Berman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself the balance of the time allotted to me.
Gentleman from California holds a minute and a half.
Mr. Speaker, we want Turkey to follow through on its commitment to return confiscated property of Christian communities and to provide compensation for properties that can't be recovered. We want Christian communities in Turkey to enjoy the same rights and privileges that religious minorities enjoy in this country. We want Turkey to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. This is not too much to ask. In fact, that is the minimum we must ask if Turkey is ever to join the ranks of the world's fully free nations. I commend my good friend and colleague, Mr. Royce, for introducing this resolution and working with me closely on this critical issue, and I urge all my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky.
I might also say that in order to ensure the future viability of the Orthodox Church, the appointment of non-Turkish citizen metropolitans to the Patriarchate's Holy Synod have been explicitly permitted in Turkey since 2004. Furthermore, in 2010, Turkey offered citizenship to metropolitans of foreign nationalities who chose to apply. Additionally, issues regarding the residence permits of foreign clergy have been resolved. I might also point out that I'd mentioned earlier that the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey had made available one of the religious scholars in Turkey to conduct a seminar at Wesley Theological Seminary. I would also mention to the body that the South Korean Methodist Church has been evangelizing in parts of Turkey, and they have a church in Antakya, which is one of the early Christian church sites that's located in Turkey, one of many. And they have been practicing their religion in Antakya. And so I would say that I don't want people to leave here with the impression that Turkey is out there deliberately trying to deny religious freedom, because that simply is not the case. Now, maybe they have a way to go, but as I've said, there's certainly nothing in this resolution that refers to anything about a genocide. This is simply talking about religious freedom, and I wanted to simply point out the steps that Turkey has been taking and continue to take. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California, Mr. Royce.
Thank you. In closing, Mr. Speaker, religious freedom is a foundation necessary, I believe, for any democracy. It's a freedom we here in America can enjoy, and frankly, it's embedded so deeply in our culture that many of us tend to take these freedoms for granted. But unfortunately, this same scenario does not exist around this globe, and I just have to tell you, Turkey has been identified on the Religious Freedom Watch list for 3 straight years. I wish that weren't the case, but it is. And frankly, I believe that what progress has comes at least in part due to this type of pressure from religious freedom reports or from resolutions. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom allows us to gather nonpartisan information on countries that violate these fundamental human rights. And it's my understanding that in 2008, the government of Turkey claimed they would return confiscated properties, but out of 1,400 claims, less than 100 were approved. Now, we have close relations with Turkey. We have common interests, and this is a friendly urging that it do more on this important issue, and frankly, one that Turkey itself has committed to improving on. But that said, with some of the statements made here today, I have to comment on an issue of which I have some personal knowledge or memory. When I was a young boy, I remember very well an Armenian in my community, a very elderly Armenian who was the sole Armenian in his village to survive the Armenian genocide. And the reason he survived was because one of his neighbors hid him. And he told me the story of the atrocities that occurred there. Now, for our ambassador, Henry Morgenthau, who detailed what was going on while he was ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, this was not something that happened in theory. It was a genocide that cost 1.5 million human lives. And the fact that even today Turkey does not acknowledge the existence of that Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, I think, should still give us pause. When we're dealing with the remnants of the population of what was once a sizable percentage of the population of that area, when we're dealing with the question of what remains 1% Greek and Armenian heritage and ethnicity that remains in Turkey today, I think it is only proper that when we have this kind of report that comes back to us from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and it details the fact that for 3 years running, rather than make progress, we've seen backsliding. I think it is time for this body to take the position and send the message: return that confiscated property to its rightful owners. Allow that small minority that remains, that wants to practice their faith, allow them to practice their faith. Allow them to continue in their schools so that the next generation that wishes to follow in that tradition can do so. That's the request here.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California retains the right for final closing. Gentleman from Kentucky.
In conclusion, I would just say and reiterate once again that in the 13th Annual Report on International Religious Freedom, the U.S. Department of State also underscored Turkey's recent efforts. During the reporting period, the government took important steps to improve religious freedom. These positive statements have replaced the status of no change in the situation regarding religious freedom in Turkey. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back his time. Gentleman from California, time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 306 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion is reconsidered and laid on the table.